In this episode, I'm talking to Erica Vass. Erica is, I'd like to say, a legend in the product management space. That would make her seem really old. She's not, but she's certainly probably one of the most regarded product leaders. I first met Erica at Zendesk. She was a director of product, and several of the teams that I was hiring for ultimately rolled up into her remit. So we've sat in interview rooms, we've sat and debriefed on interviews, we've sat and thought about interviews that went well, interviews that didn't go so well, how we should proceed with certain candidates, and worked through the intricacies of building hiring processes that were going to help us scale. In this episode, you'll hear her talk about her thoughts around hiring product managers, how to grow product teams, talking about distributed teams as well, how to lead distributed teams and how to hire for distributed teams as well as talking about some of the finer points of product management. So I hope you enjoy this one. If you do, please share, subscribe. Leave your comments. Happy to answer them. Every comment will get an answer. If you have any follow-up questions, specifically you'd like to know about anything that Erica or I have talked about, then feel free to leave them in the comments and I'll follow up with them and come back to you. Thank you, and I hope you enjoy it. Cheers. Erica Vass, good morning. Welcome. How are you?
Thank you. Good to be here. I'm well.
Erica, you've seen product built from both sort of startup and enterprise sides, and I think your sweet spot being post-PMF and scaling businesses. So I'm excited today to dive into what great product hiring and leadership looks like at different stages. Tell me, you've built and obviously led product teams across big companies like Zendesk and consulting to more earlier stage businesses. How's your view on hiring for product teams evolved over the years and through those environments?
Yeah, I think it's really interesting. I've been in product now for 15 plus years, a number of years, and seen it evolve on business needs, on business context. I've worked in large orgs, Zendesk and scale-ups as well. Like you said, really, I think that the idea of scaling a product is super interesting to me and how you leverage that. And so generally, I have worked in businesses at that phase, but at Brainmates, I get to see on all of this on a broader scale. So we collaborate with diverse product teams across various industries, stages of maturity. And what we generally am finding, and I found this for myself as well, is while certain product capabilities are universally valuable, the specific needs of a term can vary significantly depending on all of that context. And so hiring is just one aspect. But the pressing question that teams are asking now and that they need to be continuing to ask is, what capabilities do we need to develop within the team to execute our strategy effectively, and for product leadership to develop a strategy effectively? And so I think that's hand in hand. And so that might involve hiring, but it could also mean investing in coaching or conducting assessments and figuring out what's needed there. So in today's market, there's a notable shift toward valuing product managers, not only who can execute well, but who can drive business outcomes and demonstrate commercial impact. A lot of talk, you would have seen it and had it with your businesses in terms of, okay, what are we doing that'll drive outcomes? What are the outcomes? What's the impact that we want to see as soon as possible, always? And so companies are seeking PM individuals who can interpret analytics, connect insights to strategy, deliver measurable results. This isn't new. This is what product is. Some businesses lean heavily on the product execution function over the strategic arm. And I think increasingly we're seeing a pull toward the strategic side of making sure that the work that's being done, the features that are being developed, are directly in line with the outcomes that the businesses want to see, which is great. I think that's where product people should sit. It's nice to be able to be seeing the doors opening for them to be able to do this, because I think that PMs who are in feature factories generally want to be doing more strategic work with customers to make sure that the work that the product team and that they're doing and that is directly accountable and in line with what the outcomes for the business are.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. And I also think that we're now a decade down the road or so of the product manager being a recognized role. And I think the acceptance from leadership teams around the impact that product managers can have is changing and has definitely evolved. You used the term feature factory. And I think in early days of product management thinking by leadership teams, that's where they saw product managers as, we've got a roadmap of things that we want to do. This is the product that we're building. And now our product manager is really, yes, talking to customers, but they're just making sure that features go out on time. I think that's probably the older school thinking. And now,
and I think in those cases, they're not talking to customers, which is part of the problem. Like, the customer is the bit. And so those businesses that are connecting, and where they're not, that's another one of those evidences of a disconnect there in terms of the function.
Yeah. I mean, I've interviewed, don't want to say thousands, but definitely hundreds of product managers over the years. And I would certainly say there's a shift that I've seen in the kind of work that product managers want to do and where they see they can add value. And it's definitely been in the more strategic side, definitely on the more commercial side. They want to be doing things like impacting levers for reducing CAC, increasing LTV, and all these sort of metrics that the business rely on. But perhaps up until the last few years, they haven't really fully entrusted PMs to do because they're working in feature factories. I think that's been probably more prevalent here than in the US, where I think for a longer period of time they've had a more of a strategic input. But I certainly think here that we're playing catch up. We always seem to be a few years behind the US anyway. I'm interested in also as well your thoughts on the real challenge that tech businesses will face, regardless of whether early stage or they've hit PMF or they're looking to get a Series A, and this need to hire quickly because we've got milestones we want to achieve, and finding that balance between the perfect person and someone who's good enough to get us to where we need to go, that next milestone. What are your thoughts on this sort of scenario?
It's thorny. I was excited to talk to you about this because I think that you have an interesting perspective on it. I don't have the right secret sauce on that.
Mm.
I think it depends on if you've looked at what capability you need, drawing on what we were talking about earlier. Then the question is, okay, we need to hire for where we are, but also potential and adaptability. Right? The
Yeah.
person may not have all the answers, but do they possess
Mm.
the ability to capacity to learn, to grow, to align with the objectives? What is that? But also the role that you're likely hiring for has some specific skills or needs that you have that you want them to hit the ground running.
Yeah.
Um, and then on top of all of that, it's not all about their capability. It's about the team. It's about the context of the business, the product,
Mm.
the organization, the people, the mix of the functions. It's hard to get right. And I
Yeah.
think that it's so important because it's a trading in humans. These aren't resources. I don't like calling humans resources.
Mm.
It's people. And so I've interviewed many PMs who are great PMs and yet weren't necessarily the right fit at the right time for that business,
Mm.
which is hard. It's hard for the candidate who's looking for that role, and it's hard for the business because it's, oh, shucks, thought that might have been the right one, but for reasons not. And so that's where then it trails on. And then the question of, is the business looking for too many specific things? And I think that's definitely part of what needs to happen early, is to decide what is the must-haves and what are the nice-to-haves, which I think help to reduce the speed. But I've seen the stats that say that hiring the wrong product manager can cost upwards of, I'm getting the statistic, 2.5 times the employee's salary.
Yeah.
So that's a cost. That's something to sneeze at. So I think it's important to have it be a considered decision. You don't just want to hire anyone, because that's not going to work, and that doesn't set them up for success. So I think it's incumbent on the hiring manager, the leader, if there is one in the org, to think about what is going to make that person successful, and then align that to the people that you're meeting, and then saying, yeah, the odds are we can make this person successful, and we're going to invest in them while they invest in us. And that's the right mix. And that's probably the way at curtailing when the perfect candidate doesn't show up at the perfect time.
And I think there's a few things there. I think the first thing is the job of leadership is to create the conditions for success, right? The right environment, the right coaching, the right onboarding from a hiring perspective, access to the right tools, the right people. And my other sort of thought around this is, with pretty much every hire, there's a degree of compromise. Are we prepared to compromise on time? I will wait for the right person. Are we prepared to compromise on the original experience profile that we were looking for? We wanted to hire someone who has been first-time PM at multiple places because we're going to benefit from all the knowledge they've gained, and we can get traction and get to PMF quicker. For example, are we prepared to compromise on that? And the other thing that we sometimes need to compromise on is salary. So what's the commercial impact of this role? We had a budget of 150,000 for this role. After interviewing half a dozen people, we've realized that we're probably going to need to spend a bit more to get what we think is that perfect person. Is that a compromise we're prepared to make? If not, then we need to go back to the experience profile and rethink that. So there's pretty much always compromises. They said no one's perfect, but if you're balancing speed and the experience profile and the compensation, the commercial aspect, these are the things that everyone needs to think about.
It's almost the candidate role fit, similar to the product market fit. I hadn't thought of it in that context before.
Yeah.
I think that there's an opportunity in the earlier stage. There's something to be said for when hitting that next phase, senior capability is useful. And I think that that with the tools that we now have at our disposal, there is some of that leveling between the senior and the junior. If you can be scrappy and use tools and prove that you understand the commercial impacts of what it is that you're building, that goes really far. And so I think that over time there may be some of that merging where that that titling of years may not be as relevant as what is it that you can do, which I think is nice, and an entrance way for more junior candidates or people who are transferring into product and want to get involved in product to demonstrate their experience in different and new ways.
Yeah, I think one of the really sort of strategic things that I see talent acquisition and good quality agency recruiters do at the moment is to help their stakeholders understand their talent market. So product teams talk about the total addressable market for customers. There's also a TAM for candidates. So we've built our experience profile for what we think is our ideal candidate. We get out into the market, usually into places like LinkedIn or product forums, and we start understanding how many candidates fit our total addressable market of candidates. If that's 20 in Melbourne, if you're hiring in Melbourne, that have been a first-time PM and scale the business. So there's 20 potential people that are in your total addressable market. How many of those are likely to move to your business? You break this down really simply. That might make them people think differently about the experience profile, the compensation, the time to hire. And these are all things that you need to be factoring into your workforce planning, regardless of which stage you're at. So I think that's a concept that I think perhaps more strategic talent acquisition teams are thinking about.
It's definitely applying the strategic thinking and strategic research part of what PMs do to the business to the hiring. I've done it with my teams in terms of the organization, but I haven't yet taken it to the level of the hiring aspect.
Yeah. When you're assembling or you've been advising on product teams, what sort of traits or signals do you look for in candidates that go beyond what's in a resume?
I've got C's for this. First is the capability. This one I talked to a fair bit. I'll just run through them. Capability, customer, curiosity, and communication. And so capability is where are they on their journey as a PM and defining the vision and strategy, all the good meaty PM stuff, and measuring hypothesis and executing and delivering and outcomes and story, all that. Customer. So we talked a little bit before about customer, but the number of PM interviews I've had where people wouldn't mention the customer, whether it's an internal customer or an external, that doesn't matter. But the fact that they're focused on the customer outcomes and the business outcomes. And really, for me, I'm looking for a customer focus within a strategic business context and merging those two. And if the customer isn't included and we're just focused on the business, then we're missing the customer. And that's the whole point, in theory. And so can they create a vision, a strategy, drive outcomes for the business with the customer?
Yeah.
Then there's curiosity. PMs, and generally PMs should be curious and interested in change, in learning and ideas and experiments. It really is the way to success, regardless of the context of the organization. How could we do this better? Asking questions as opposed to assuming that they know the answers, because PMs are about how and presenting the why. So things are always changing and scale ups. And so the adaptive skills there really become key. And so the last one I have is communication. Can they tell a compelling story, bring others on the journey, create elevator pitches, present to leadership about their strategy? It doesn't matter how good you are at executing if you can't bring people along on the journey in an organization as opposed to just your individual projects, and then you're going to have a harder time. And so the communication really is incumbent there, and building those skills and different levels of communication.
That also that absolutely all makes sense, and it makes me think of a line that came out or a phrase that came out in a discussion I had with the first CPO that I worked directly with in a SaaS business. We were hiring that company's first ever product team, and he made the comment that most product managers manage no one, but they lead everyone. And so there's things you talk about: curiosity, communication, all these sort of things. They all roll up into this idea of you don't necessarily manage your part of the dev team or the design team, whatever it is, but you're leading everybody on the journey with the customer sort of at the North Star of what it is that you're trying to do. So, yeah, I think it's a good one for people to think about. And I guess those are all things that anyone listening, if they're thinking of hiring, they should be jotting these down. I'll put these in the notes, but these are good things for them to be looking out for in candidates that they're potentially interviewing. At Zendesk, you led globally distributed teams across sort of developer experience and platform products. What hiring or team building lessons came from that experience?
I'd always managed teams that were local to me. And it was a thing. I was like, oh, I'm an in-person kind of manager, leader type person. And I was asked to take on strategic leadership of the team in Dublin from Melbourne, which is the worst time zone. Maybe. I don't know. I can't think of a worse one from here. I'm in Melbourne. And I was like, I don't know how this is going to go, but hey, I'm curious. Let's give it a shot. Let's be nimble and agile and all the things. And I didn't know how that would be because what does it mean to do that? How do you do that effectively
Mm.
when hiring, but when leading the team and when helping those people develop and ultimately drive to the strategic outcomes that we wanted. And so that was very interesting. I had a PM that I began with, and so they were there already. And so them within the portfolio that I was in, and it was a line manager, but they were people local who would also help in terms of if there was a need, because I'm not local, and figuring that out. And then that person left, and then I hired. The hiring process was largely the same in that it is defining what's needed, working with your partners, doing the interviews. They would be working with me anyway, and so doing interviews remotely wasn't part of the issue. And so within that world, there wasn't too much different. What I learned over time, though, was that the way of working was different, and I was able to build some of what I was learning to improve my more local relationships. A quick story. I hired a new PM in Dublin. I was all very excited. He was starting on the Monday, had his orientation. I wanted to welcome him and just say hi. It was late in the day. I don't remember if it was daylight savings or not, but I think we were catching up around 8:00 local time, PM, our time. I always made one of the things was I always made me have the hardship in the time zone, not my team member, whether it was in Dublin or San Francisco. And so I pinged him and I was like, okay, I haven't had dinner yet, so I'm starving. So I'm going to eat while we talk, but I want to welcome you. And it was just a casual chat. Great. We had a lovely chat. I welcomed him. I answered some questions. All was fine. Great. We established this long-running good relationship. A few years later, I heard him tell the story of his first day we had a PM summit. And so there were other people and he was like, oh, my first day, I was very nervous. I was meeting my boss my manager for the first time. And I get on a call and she's shoving pizza in her mouth. And he was like, I was immediately at ease. And I was like, oh, I didn't realize that was it. I had no idea that's how he was going to be and that he was nervous and that this was, but fortunately it worked out well. But what I realized over time was that while he's working and asking me a question, let's say I'm slacking from my couch, or it's just a more casual environment for me because it was off hours, I had greater transparency in that relationship. I was much more at ease. I was like, he asked me a question, I write back what I'm thinking. It's nighttime for me, so I'm going to eat my dinner and I'm going to whatever that's going to be, where during the day, maybe I'm more all business. And so all of those relationships that I established in that way were really healthy, great, like feedback and growth for them and growth for me and good outcomes in their products. And I was like, oh, there's something to this. And so what I was able to do as I thought through that was to really bring that to my local relationships and be like, oh, I should just be that person who's whatever those qualities were that I was able to bring to that. I then brought to more of my local relationships, and that's helped as well.
And that was way before COVID. So was with working remotely, was factoring in things like the candidates or your potential new hires comfort with working potentially asynchronously at times. There's longer distance communication. Communication is different over distance and time than it is when you're in person, obviously. You need to be more concise. There's more scope for things to be misinterpreted in the written word than in a conversation. Did that factor into your thinking around who you're going to hire, like their comfort and their ability to do that?
Have full control. And so we automatically had to be working with lots of teams across lots of geographies. And so that was a requirement regardless of where you were based. And then how we do that effectively was the question, and how do we clear the blockers and enable reduced dependencies and all of those things. That was a criteria for everyone in that way, of not it being incredibly unique. But it was definitely part of the adaptive skills that who was going to join in any of those teams needed to bring, because if they couldn't do that, then they were going to struggle in that way.
Yeah, that makes sense. Moving on to perhaps more of the sort of consultative work you've been doing. When startups first start hiring product managers and maybe they bring in their first or their sort of early team, what common mistakes do you see? How can they avoid them?
Some of the mistakes are just not having a plan. That really the idea of deciding ahead of time what you want and then working that through, as opposed to just saying, let's do a thing. So you have to, that idea of slowing down to speed up, I think is important to that team building, because otherwise you're going to end up with a lot of timing things and people things and mismatches and misalignments, which gets really hard. I think we've seen forming new, fresh cross-functional teams really hard. That's a moment to really be purposeful about, because you're contending with organizational change and how you work, establishing functions, creating teams of people in the functions who need to fit with each other in an environment that's still looking for the outcomes, and that kind of is agnostic to all that. It's make it happen, but there's a lot there to make happen.
Yeah.
So I think that the biggest risks or mistakes are not being clear and aligned about
Yeah.
who is needed and why. So they need to be deliberate and strategic in their recruitment processes. At a
Yeah.
tactical level,
Mm.
I recommend realistic role and job descriptions, not so expansive. We talked about
Mm.
this.
Mm.
So you don't want to deter diverse applicants or not putting on criteria that doesn't really matter just for the sake of it. And then
Yeah.
the other piece is being really clear about what success is for
Mm.
a role in particular.
Yeah.
What's their scope of ownership within the portfolio, who their partners are to deliver their vision,
Mm.
and what their desired ways of working is. And that way you can find the person who gels with that.
Yeah. And I think from an onboarding perspective as well, I think there's a fair bit of work in sort of communication that probably needs to happen to the rest of the team, engineering teams, if there's a design team, if there's some kind of product or sales team, which you'd think there would be, that we're bringing this person in the way, to your point, the ways of working, the ways that communication now are going to change will impact everybody. So we all need to be prepared for this. And we think this is what it's going to look like. So get ready, get maybe your back office in order to be able to share files, your documentation, all these sorts of things. So I think it's more than making sure the new hire is ready for the business. It's make sure the business is ready for the new hire.
Definitely. And
Yeah.
then it comes to not only individuals being open to whatever that is, but also in the collaboration and then the experiment of it. The worst thing that someone can do when they join a business is assume that everything that they've done before is going to work the same. There's a lot of
Yeah.
writing about whether you've worked in large orgs and then you go to the startups and the difference there.
Mm.
But even those who we see move from like size and type businesses to others, just because it worked somewhere doesn't mean it's going to work somewhere else. And so it's about testing that or saying, what does that look like in its day to day for this, or running it as an experiment and seeing what hits and what doesn't? Because
Yeah.
ultimately, the how we work changes can only be effective if they're adopted by
Mm.
the teams
Mm.
who are working that way, versus a person who's pushing something through a door that won't open.
Yeah. And that's such a good point in that just because someone's been successful in doing something at company A, it doesn't necessarily mean that their time at company B is going to replicate that, because teams are different, people are different, ways of working, ways of communicating, customer sets, customer groups are all different for
And
the most.
the market's changing,
Yeah.
which means that way of being. Also, new roles evolve. Just
Mm.
like right now, there's the calibration of PMs being seen as, and they always were, but being seen as more strategic and more aligned to those outcome deliverables. That means that they're going to be in conversations that maybe they weren't in before. They're going to be driving decisions
Mm.
that others aren't used to. And so that change and what the outcomes could be different because there's new information and new people in the conversation. And so the business needs to be open to that as well, which is
Yeah.
the point of hiring the person. So
Mm.
in theory, they are, but in practice, humans are complicated beings, aren't we?
We are. It'd be so much easier if we weren't.
I don't know though. I'm going to say no to the robots.
You've obviously worked closely with founders and exec teams. How can hiring managers and product leaders better align hiring with founders' expectations without losing clarity of the bigger picture? And I think particularly for early stage businesses where the founder is so closely linked to the product, it's usually their idea, their baby, that there's potential challenges for them of letting something go. How does that all happen? Is there a best practice for making that happen as smoothly as possible?
I think I don't know if there's a best practice. I
Right.
think from my perspective, it's very specific as to context and the person and the stage. Why are they doing it now? In other words, okay, you're hiring a product person, a product leader, a product manager. What is it that you want from that? Which goes to not only the tactics of what do we want out of the role, but what space are we asking them to take up? And then the recognition of, okay, they're taking that space and
Mm.
how does that interaction occur? And I think that
Yeah.
in that world, it has to be a partnership. And where I've seen it successfully done,
Mm.
it is informed by role clarity, transparent communication about the vision, the strategy, what's known and unknown at any particular time.
Yeah.
And then there's a discussion about how to develop the team's capacity to learn and grow in that way. I
Yeah.
think tactically, what it does is it requires frequent check-ins as well, which may not be done as much in terms of my recommendation on best practice is because high level things change.
Mm.
There's things changing all the time. And if the check-ins and the calibrations aren't happening regularly, then the dissonance occurs. And that's hard to get past because if it's not seen and recognized for what it is, then it
Mm.
just creates a barrier that's harder to overcome, especially when it's not seen. It's kind of like you're running off a cliff and you don't know that there's a valley there. And so
Mm.
do you
Yeah.
stop shorter? Or what happens? How do you get over that? You have to build the bridge.
Yeah. And I think all of this comes back to a couple of phrases that have come up is clarity in the first place and communication, but also the recognition, as you said, that things are going to change and we may need to pivot our thinking, pivot our strategy, pivot the way we approach problems and tackle things. Flexibility and adaptability, I guess, is what we're saying.
Product leader, the product manager, in that case, though, it's important to show up as a strategic leader for the company. In other words, if the PM in those cases gets caught up in the tactics and goes into the turtle shell on the features and the tactics and all of the things that are happening and that doesn't align to strategy, they can't align to strategy or improve the strategy, then that becomes disconnected from the product function's core value. And that's a little bit even harder to see. And so it's important that through all of those conversations in that product person's role, that they are always ongoing, looking at the strategy, looking to develop what's not there, and then align whatever's happening to that and making those connections, which I think which generally we've seen builds trust and builds understanding from the rest of the organization that this is the space that person's taking.
Yeah. Interesting use of the word trust. It's one of those things, isn't it, that you've got to build up over time, but if you can start showing that things are moving in the right direction, you can actually build really rapidly.
Especially these days.
Yeah. Let's move on to people that are product managers that are looking to join startup, looking for that next role. If someone's considering joining an early stage business, what's one critical question you think they should be asking of the business that they're potentially joining?
There's a million questions. I think the one critical, you're going to ask all the functional things, but I think the one that really gets at the heart of it is, what does success look like for this role?
Right.
And that'll tell the candidate, the hiring manager, where the team's thinking is as far as what their tasks are, and what good looks like and what box they're being put in, and gives them the chance to expand that box by saying, oh, I don't think that's the role. I think the role is this. What do you think? Which sometimes needs to happen. And also to calibrate if there are metrics, understanding what those are, and then seeing if that's something that is interesting to them or not, or asking those questions. I think fundamentally what that question does for the business as well is saying, oh, okay, they're focused on outcomes, right? With the outcome of their career, which is good, because the outcome of a product person is the outcome of the product and the business, which is the right viewpoint and framing to put on things.
Because the success of the business and the product is ultimately reflects back to the success of the product manager for promotions, advancements, better mastery, future roles, and all that sort of thing. These two are inextricably linked, aren't they?
And you'll know what you need to kick goals, which really is everyone's goal. One of the interesting things, maybe it's interesting to you, I think it's interesting, is hiring. I've said to people in the past that the goal of the hiring team or the group that's doing the hiring for the particular role on a panel, for example, is not to weed people out. It's to find people in. It's to bring them in. It's to find the things about them that would be great to add, versus the things about them which are the things to say, oh, they're not the right person for us. And so by being inclusive as opposed to exclusive in that, I think that really draws the best of the product person, but also for the business, because you may be finding that there's something in that person that's additive that you didn't think of, that you're like, oh, actually, that would be really cool, because if you are indeed checking in with what you're trying to do as a strategy, you want to bring people in. You want to hire for potential and adaptability. And by just saying, oh, this person doesn't do a thing, maybe you're missing out on some great candidates.
Yeah. One of the other things that I think is important, but it's hard, I think it's one of the quickest things that sort of gets dropped off the to-do list, and something that I know we did at Zendesk, and just spoiler for anyone listening, Erica and I worked together at Zendesk years ago, it feels like years ago now, was running retros on your hiring processes. Yeah, on interviews. Hey, how did that interview go? Did we get everything we wanted out of it? Was the interview structure correct and appropriate for the level of the role? What are we learning about candidates as we go? Because I still think that a big part of your hiring process and the way your hiring teams are looking at these things is, yes, to find ways to include people and count them in, as you've just described, but also how do we evolve and we all get better as a hiring team at interviewing and hiring, so that we're minimizing our future risk of people not working out, because that's ultimately what we're trying to do. This idea that if someone doesn't work out, it's probably a 3 month, it's a whole quarter out of your year between that person leaving, you as a hiring team realigning on what it is that you need, redefining a role if you have to, getting out into the market to find candidates, interviewing people, and then if a candidate's got a month's notice period, you've eaten up 3 months before you know it. That's a big chunk out of your runway and out of the things that you're trying to deliver. So thinking strategically about how you minimize and mitigate your risk by getting better at hiring and decision making, I think comes from having really good conversations and retros on how your hiring works. Is that stuff that you've done since our time together, other businesses you've worked at?
Yeah, I think that debrief is important. What's
Mm.
worked, what hasn't, where has it not worked? I'd seeded in the time since Zendesk, I seeded an entire distributed team, and which settled in, which is
Yeah.
always nice to see. And then it's okay, what worked well there? How did that
Yeah.
happen? Some of it was, and what didn't when it didn't, and it didn't quite settle. Where was that? And I think some of that comes into which roles do you need to hire first? How did the functions work together? What needs to happen there? Those conversations are key. Otherwise, you're not learning. You're just repeating the same
Yeah.
stuff. And I think that the learnings is what, especially as a team starts to gel, you start to
Yeah.
feel like you're hitting a rhythm. And I don't think you're going to be hiring a ton. I don't think scaling a product and scaling a business isn't saying it to you, but it doesn't mean you're going to hire tons of people. It means you're scaling the product and you need to have the people to be able to do that, which could
Mm.
mean a couple of people in different functions. It could
Yeah.
mean a team to do a thing and what that is. And so if you have the ability then to, even if you're not doing it regularly all the time, to grow hundreds of people a year or something like that, it's still, you can find your winnings and your learnings off
Yeah.
of that. And then next
Yeah.
time you go to do it, it'll be that much easier, especially
Yeah.
when you're picking up a process, when you're
Mm.
doing, I think when organizations are doing lighter hiring, but specifically for reasons at times, picking up that process and knowing what that is and having those learnings is nice because you're not starting from scratch each time.
Yeah. Yeah. Just going into a little bit the actually interviewing and how we think about potential candidates. I've had this thing recently. It was sparked by a conversation I had a couple of days ago, where someone made the comment of this person wasn't ambitious enough, and and I think I understood what they were getting at, but it's I don't know if you have this. You have these conversations that ferment in the back of your mind as you go along, and they pop up every now and then. And I think sometimes we over-index on ambition, because ambition can be many things, right? Having a secure job can be an ambition for people. Having technical mastery at something can be an ambition. I think generally we think of ambition as, I want to get promoted and I want to be successful. I want to be an entrepreneur. I want to have a C-suite role. Do we over-index on ambition at times, do you think?
I think that the term can be defined, its
Mm.
context, different ways. If it means they aren't demonstrating through their activities and the way that they are, that they're leaning into things. And the question is, are they, and they're just not demonstrating that, or are they not so interested, right? And if
Yeah,
not interested means, they're going to work from home and we're not going to trust that they're working, there's
yeah,
follow-on effects to what that means. If it is, I see an outcome and I'm mildly competitive and I want to achieve that and win, what are the different ways that the people can demonstrate that? There was a bit of a cultural thing between the US and Australia that we encountered several years ago, where the US team was leaning in the ways that Americans do. I can say that. I
yeah,
have the accent. I'm
yeah,
from the US,
yeah.
at least as a stereotype. And the
Mm.
Aussies are pretty chill, not leaning out, but just, yep, cool. And so there was something that was urgent. And so the US teams were like, or whoever was talking, the leader was, this is urgent. And the
Yeah.
Australian teams were like, yep, we got it. And I was a middle person and
Mm.
able to intermediate that conversation. The question was, do they have it?
Yeah.
I'm not. I'm nervous. Is there? It was,
Mm.
to your words, is there the ambition there? Which wasn't what they were saying, but I was like, yeah, no, they're good. Like, they understand the level of urgency and they think they have a plan and they're going to execute on it and win. And they're like, okay. But it was, I had to calibrate that and make sure that before I
Yeah.
represented it, but it was just in that communication, the styles
Mm.
of the different cultures
Yeah.
that hit. But I think it goes to your point, which is, if I wasn't there as an intermediary, I think there would have been an extreme disconnect of
Mm. Mm.
saying, uh, it's the same thing of, oh, maybe they're not ambitious enough, or they're not going to hit the target, or they don't
Yeah.
understand, they're not listening, whatever those things are. And it was really just how different cultures and different people communicate that. So I think
Yeah.
my general recommendation and best practices is that when you're talking to someone and you have the thing that discounts them, double down on it and
Mm.
ask more around that to make sure that your first impression or whatever that is truly what's at play.
And tip for Aussies working with in American companies: if you want people to know that you've got it, just say things like "smash it," "crush it," and that'll generally get the message across. Looking forward, then, how do you see product hiring and team building evolving over the next few years?
I think that we talked a little bit about product specific stuff earlier,
Mm.
so I'll hit the generic
Mm.
elephant in the room of AI and what that's doing for the profession. So then to the profession, I will say
Yeah.
that may be a bold statement, but really PMs, by virtue of being the conduit and the function that's responsible for developing and driving a product strategy, based on a commercial business strategy and all of the follow-on effects of that in terms of what the roadmap is in collaborating with their cross-functional peers have a key role to play. And so the question then is, how does AI intersect with that? I'm doing a talk at Leading the Product later this month on strategic foresight and the importance of thinking about where the business will be in the future and where the world will be and how the business should respond to that, and how pairing with AI can help inform some of those results and outcomes to positive business outcomes. And so I think that AI is going to insert itself into all of this. I think it's an enabler for sure, the tooling and the abilities for PMs especially to take on more of the functional roles than they had done in the past. You can get a prototype up, you can create imagery that helps you tell your stories, then to have your designers improve upon and make better. That speeds up the process of learning, which for a product team is massive. I think the things that teams and individuals are doing with regard to using those tools to learn quickly and to try things out is awesome. So I think that the hiring needs to reflect the changes. Individuals need to reduce their rigidity, try everything. PMs right now should be doing all the things. Some of it will be useful, some of it won't be. You'll get funny stories out of it. Everyone does. Whenever I mention the topic, I get a flurry of responses of what people are doing. LinkedIn's got 1 million of them. I think it could be scary because it's change, and there's the question of the role, the perception of the role is changing, and the tool set's changing, and the capabilities changing. But it's the perfect time to get involved, I think, because the community is all learning together and figuring it out and developing a playbook. And so being a part of that, I think, as a product person is exciting.
And I love that thinking that AI is happening for product managers, it's not happening to them. I think that's so applicable across all the sort of roles generally in a business at the moment.
Yeah, I think that we need the human aspects of what a product manager, product leader brings to the business, and how that's enabled through additional information that's useful and additional creativity inputs and whatnot is only good. And I don't think, certainly yet, that the machines are capable of doing that entirely without us, but augmenting that is a good thing. But it's important for the PMs to take a seat at the table.
Yes.
I think we've talked about how there's a desire for product managers to be seen as and be more commercial, but be seen as more commercial and more tied to those outcomes. And I think with the AI, it's similar, where there's a vacuum, a void of that. And it's for PMs to take that space to bring the strategic elements within the tool set and really augment those conversations to positive impact, because then their impact on the business is huge.
Yeah.
As opposed to the opposite, which is that there's a negative amount and a void of what that looks like.
Yeah. The talk that you're doing for Leading the Product, is that an IRL one, or is that a video conference? What is it?
It's in person in Sydney and Melbourne in the middle of the month in May.
I'll find the details and I'll pop a link in wherever people are seeing this. If people want to connect with you and chat about all things product, you happy for me to share your LinkedIn profile?
Absolutely. It's public. Feel free. I'm happy to meet people. I enjoy the community. I've been a part of the Melbourne tech community now for just over 10 years. Somehow time has flown, and it's great. And Sydney, it's great. So I'm happy to chat with anyone who wants to ping me.
Perfect. Erica Vass, thank you so much. It's been an absolute pleasure. Learned a lot.
Thank you for having me.
Cheers.
Bye.